This week on Just Solutions, the Free Britney movement has brought much needed attention to the conservatorship system, but many people say this disability rights issue has long needed closer scrutiny. An estimated 1.5 million Americans are under some form of a conservatorship, where a court appoints a third party to make personal, financial and medical decisions on their behalf. Many of these people are disabled adults who advocates say have been stripped of their rights. Journalist Sara Luterman has written in The Nation magazine about the intersection of disability and reproductive rights and how many women in conservatorships are being forced to take birth control. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Sara, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, so many people have become aware of this issue because of the high-profile nature of what's happening with Britney Spears. But as you write in The Nation magazine, disability rights advocates are not in any way surprised by what we're learning about what Britney Spears has been subject to. And in fact, the forced sterilization, not just forced contraceptive use, but forced sterilization has a long history in this country. I mentioned there that 1.5 million adults, that's the estimation by the AARP, but because of the scant data that's available, we're not even sure if that's an accurate figure. Give us a sense of the scope of the problem. How many people do you think are under these type of conservatorships right now?
I mean, I don't have a reason to doubt the AARP number. Their guess is as good as anyone's. There's basically every state has its own system. There's not really any public federal reporting. There aren't really federal standards about what a conservatorship, or sometimes called guardianship, should or shouldn't have in it. So yeah, I usually use the AARP's estimate in my own work because they're the only people who've made an estimate. It's really unclear. I'm actually not even sure what methodology they used, but they are the only people who have made an estimate. So I do usually just roll with that.
Well, in your article in The Nation, and you've written a few times about this, and you've written extensively about disability rights and politics and various different things. But this particular issue, as I said, this has a long history. The forced sterilization and the forced use of contraceptives has a long history in this country, and you outlined that in your article. Could you just take us through that and why so many people that you spoke to are not in any way surprised about what's happening to Britney Spears?
Yeah, so in the United States, we have a long history of sterilizing people, particularly with intellectual disabilities, mental health and mental illness. So basically back during around the 1900s to the 1920s was sort of the peak of the eugenics movement in the United States. The idea behind eugenics is that that you could sort of improve the race, usually the white race, if we're going to be totally honest here, by selectively breeding people the same way you do with dogs or horses. So this was an incredibly popular idea, led to the state sterilizing hundreds of thousands of women. In California, actually had one of the largest forced sterilization programs, and eventually sterilized about 20,000 people. They actually recently have just passed a bill that's waiting to be signed to pay reparations to the survivors of that sterilization. Sterilization also often broke along racial lines and not just disability lines. So, for example, Black women in the South were often subjected to sterilization. It was so common that it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. And in Puerto Rico, about a third of adult women there at one point were sterilized by the U.S. government, or by U.S. government-sponsored doctors.
This definitely seems to be a gendered issue insofar as women are much more likely to be sterilized if they are under some type of conservatorship or guardianship. Now, you mentioned a much broader sterilization program there, but I know folks that you spoke to say it's more likely to be women who are subject to this.
Yeah, that actually surprised me. I mean, I've been covering these issues for a long time, and I was actually really surprised by how heavily gendered the issue was. One of the lawyers I spoke with, I think, said that like maybe people are getting vasectomies for their male children with disabilities, but like he's never heard of it happening, basically. So it seems like a large degree of the concern has to do with people who can give birth and with pregnancy. But that's not how it's normally framed. So like for example, in California, because they had one of the most advanced eugenics programs in the United States, which actually was an inspiration for the Nazis, unfortunately, they also have a law that prohibits sterilizing someone for the purpose of disability. However, what that means is that people just look for other reasons. So like, for example, there's a court case in which like a woman, her mother asked the court for her to be sterilized because she has like period cramps and migraines. And like, for you or me, like as people who aren't under conservatorship, like if we have period cramps or migraines, like that's not even like fifth line treatment. Like a hysterectomy is not how you deal with that. But that's like the reasoning that gets used in a lot of cases for people with certain kinds of disabilities in the court for sterilization.
Now, and that particular court case that you cite and that you write about in your article shows how vulnerable people in conservatorships are in the court system. They really do not have adequate legal representation, as we've seen through the Britney Spears case. She's recently been allowed to select her own attorney, but many, many people do not have adequate representation. And so I believe in that case that you just mentioned there, the mother went to the judge who said, well, I don't really like your arguments, but I kind of agree with the ultimate goal of this. So
yeah,
he rubber stamped it.
Yeah. I mean, actually, a lot of the time, so like in Oregon, for example, people are supposed to go to the court when they're going to do a sterilization, but oftentimes they don't. It actually is relatively rare that people actually follow the procedure that they're supposed to follow when getting someone under conservatorship or guardianship, as it's called in Oregon, sterilized. A lot of doctors will just treat it like any other medical procedure, which it's not.
What are some of the reasons that are given? You mentioned in that particular court case that the mother said she was concerned because her daughter was suffering heavy cramps during her period and also migraines. That was the reason given for sterilization. But when we're seeing this happen over and over again, what are often the arguments that are made in favor of this? Because this will ultimately be done by a medical practitioner. So I'd imagine there must be some sort of reason that's given that must pass some level of a medical reason as to why people are getting these major, major interventions performed.
Yeah, so I don't think that the reasons are explicitly eugenic anymore, at least not in any like conscious, overt sense. Because like, I mean, if you were to ask someone like who's seeking a sterilization why they're doing it, and I've done that before for other people, like there's another piece I was reporting on that might come out later, where I talked to someone who was involved in the sterilization of her sister. And like, she was like a pretty like, liberal, progressive person. She was, she had like a Black Lives Matter flag in the background during the Zoom interview. And when I asked, like, and when we were talking about it, she just casually sort of said like that it was necessary, that it was something that was sort of like had to be done because like for her sister's own good. And so that's like the big difference between how this kind of sterilization used to function during the eugenics era versus now, is that like instead of being for like the good of like the race, the white race as a whole, it's sort of seen as being for the good of the individual. And sometimes that might be true. I mean, most women use some form of birth control at some point in their lives. but it also might not be true. And sterilization is a very permanent solution.
This idea that this is for the good of the person, I mean, that really underpins the conservatorship or the guardianship program. And certainly, as we're seeing in the Spears case, that she was deemed to not be able to act in her best interest, and this system was set in place. One of the startling things that has emerged from that, but as we have said, this is not a surprise to disability rights advocates who say, you know, the hashtag not just Britney, is how you're essentially stripped of all your rights when you are under a program like this. We've heard that very often you can't have your own legal representation. You really are, as I said, completely stripped of your human rights. I mean, these are pretty significant. And the fact that very often they're never reversed.
Yeah, there are some disability advocates who call conservatorship civil death, because the idea is that you just lose all of the rights that an ordinary citizen has. You sort of, in a legal sense, stop being a person. And I'm really excited about like the Not Just Britney hashtag, because I really want people to think about this in like a holistic sense. Like, Britney Spears should not be going through this, but also maybe no one should be going through this. Like maybe there's a systemic problem here. And so I'm just really excited to see people's interest in Britney Spears sort of ballooning out to this broader civil rights question.
Given that the overwhelming idea behind these programs is to help people who can often be incredibly vulnerable and in most cases really can't necessarily make decisions from themselves, what are some of the alternatives? You know, if we want to recognize that people still have agency, still have autonomy, how can we change, abolish, or adapt these programs to give people more rights or recognize the fact that they do have agency and autonomy?
Yeah, so in schools, when we're addressing things like special education and accommodation, the standard is what's called a least restrictive environment. So like the least intervention necessary, the most independence possible for the child is what is best. But we don't have that same standard for adults under guardianship or conservatorship. So there are like some other alternatives to guardianship that I think are really promising. I'm particularly interested in supported decision making, which is has been mostly used in people with intellectual disabilities so far, but there's actually been a case in DC recently involving a woman with dementia. And the idea is to sort of, instead of the person losing all of their civil rights, they have sort of a group of, what's the word? Of advisors. They have a group of advisors, and depending on the state and what pilot program we're talking about, those advisors might be informal, like family and friends. They might be more formal, like they might be court appointed. And those advisors help the person make as many decisions as they can with advice and guidance. And I think that it's a really interesting system, because I guess I want to push back. Like there are always going to be people who might not be able to understand or communicate specific kinds of decisions, but I think fundamentally everyone can make decisions. Part of being a human being is having preferences, wanting things, not wanting other things. Like those are just fundamental to humanity, and they're true for people with disabilities and for people without disabilities.
It does seem that there's a bit of a patchwork quilt effect insofar as different states have different regulations about this.
Yeah.
Do we need some type of overhaul at a federal level of the system? And I know that there has recently been some legislation, bipartisan legislation introduced really on the back of the hashtag Free Britney movement. What are your thoughts on what's happening at a federal level, and is that something that's really needed?
Yeah, so there's like a couple different federal efforts, and some of them are more promising than others. So for example, I think it was a representative out of I want to say South Carolina, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, it's I remember that it's called the Circus Act. It's an acronym that stands for something, I guess after the Britney Spears album. But like that was really like a publicity stunt, because if you actually like look at the proposals they're making, like they're requiring that in order to receive birth control, if you're under guardianship or conservatorship, you have to give written consent, which is like a ridiculous standard. There are a lot of people who can make decisions about their own reproductive autonomy, but might not be able to read or write. Like those aren't the same thing. So it's sort of just like a silly idea. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. But then there's like these bigger bipartisan calls. I know Elizabeth Warren signed on to a letter calling for more bipartisan reform, and that looks a lot more promising. I'm especially interested in sort of the call for more and better data collection, because like just step one to fixing a system is knowing what's going on. And we don't have a good concept of that because there just isn't like any large scale federal monitoring or standards. So I'm really interested to see where this goes, but it is going to be slow going, unfortunately.
Well, if our viewers would like to weigh in on this, please join the conversation. You can leave a message wherever you're watching us right now on social media. Let us know your thoughts on this particular issue that is really a civil and human rights issue. It has obviously been brought to attention because of what's happening with Britney Spears, but as we are hearing, this is something that is affecting so many people. Sara, July is Disability Pride Month. Is there anything that we should be proud of when it comes to disability rights right now in 2021 in the US?
Well, I'm personally really excited by the unusual and really fantastic number of disability advocates who have transitioned into the federal government and the White House under the Biden administration. I'm especially excited about Dr. Kim Nackstat, who is a policy advisor for President Biden on disability. She's part of the Domestic Policy Council, and that's amazing. It's a game changer, because previously the only disability advisor in the White House under President Obama had been a community liaison. Like there wasn't a conversation about policy happening. It was just sort of about like having a relationship with a minority community. So having someone who's at the table talking about like the policy needs of the community is huge. I'm really excited about that. There's also a lot of movement around $400 billion that the Biden administration pledged to radically improve and increase home care, accessibility to home care in the United States, that I think is incredibly exciting. And we'll see if it, the big concern right now is if lawmakers might like wuss out at the price tag a little bit. But it's really like the sort of thing where like we need it. It's a system that's just been underfunded and shortchanged for decades, and the result is poorer quality care and employee shortages. So this is like, it's going to be expensive, but it's necessary. And I feel at least I feel hopeful that Congress will do what needs to be done.
Let's talk a little bit about why that is so important and how this type of federal reform is needed. Because for so many people who are, say, relying on federal funding for their care, Medicaid, that often meant that they would have to go into some type of residential system as opposed to staying at home, because the way the funding mechanism was set up. And I know there's been a big movement for many years to have the money follow the person as opposed to going straight to an institution, allow them to use that money for in-home care, which has also been proven to be a lot less expensive as well as being the choice for so many people. You know, talk a little bit more about this, because there's long waiting lists right now for in-home care. And I think COVID has also highlighted why this is an option, not just for disabled Americans, but for anybody who needs any kind of in-home care, elderly, you know, young people, that having that ability to have that care in your home is actually a very positive thing for so many people.
Yeah, I mean, so the disability rights movement, since its inception, has framed home care as a civil rights issue. And like from like a outsider perspective, it can be kind of hard to see that. It's like, well, isn't this a service, you know? But But the thing is, like, what it does is it gives people control over their own lives. I mean, some people need assistance doing really basic, they're called activities of daily living. So like getting dressed, showering, using the bathroom, and being able to get care in your own home means you have control over when those things happen. Whereas people in institutions don't necessarily get to make those decisions. People in nursing homes don't necessarily get to make those decisions. I actually wrote a piece for The Nation last year about, it's the headline's a little inflammatory. It's called "It's Time to Abolish Nursing Homes." And it's sort of about this like growing interest in moving to a more community-based system and why things are so heavily weighted towards institutions.
In addition to July being a Disability Pride Month, we've seen some visuals there from some of the Pride parades that have taken place in years gone by. Obviously, with COVID, we're not seeing as many this year. It also marks the 31st anniversary of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that really centred on transportation and accessibility for buildings and transit, because that was seen back then as such a crucial thing. Now we're having much broader discussions. What are the conversations that we should be having, Sara? And you know, to bring it back to our original conversation, how what's happening with Britney Spears has really put this into mainstream coverage. But what are the parts of the story that we should really be focusing on that maybe is being missed by the media?
Yeah, so there's something that disability rights advocates say that I think is really interesting, and that's that the Americans with Disability Act is the floor. Like, that's the starting point, is just access to like things like ramps, things like Braille. Like that's baseline, and then from there we need to build forward. So I do think transportation is actually still a really big issue. One of the issues that the Department of Transportation has been looking into is the number of wheelchairs that are seriously damaged by airlines every year. It's actually quite a large number. They just started tracking that number last year, and it's tens of thousands of wheelchairs. Like, imagine if airlines broke that many people's legs. It would be like, we'd deal with it right away, but because it's people with disabilities, there's just sort of been a slow reaction. So it's exciting to see like more attention on that. I think that expansion of home care is absolutely fundamental. And I think that like access to the community in meaningful ways, not just ramps, but like things like library programs, things like competitive employment, things like just being able to go to a restaurant. Like those are things that a lot of people still don't have access to, even with the ADA. Also, sorry, I'm looking at the long list, I guess. I think abolition of SubMinimum Wage is another thing that's sort of interesting that's coming down the pipeline. Certain people with disabilities, it's legal to pay them pennies per hour still. And so there's been some movement towards ending that practice. There's just so much going on and so many exciting things in store. Social Security reform, that's another one. Yeah, I'm just astonished by all of the amazing work advocates are doing in this area. It's really exciting.
You know, each of those areas deserve their own show, Sara.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I do want to just reiterate what you said there about the sub-minimum wage. It's something you've written about as well, because of course disability rights intersects with every other form of rights, including labour rights, and that disabled adults have been subject to this, where they are legally allowed to be paid well below, as you said, pennies on for their work, and the work is often menial, often repetitive, because of this idea that there's inherent dignity in the work. However, there's no dignity if the person is not being treated with respect. Maybe just dig into that a little bit more. And as I said, each of these topics deserve their own show, but just before we move on, talk a little bit about why that aspect is so important for reform as well.
Yeah, so outside of the disability area and sort of more squarely in the labor rights area, Sarah Jaffe wrote this really great book that I recommend to everyone called "Work Won't Love You Back." And so like, I just feel like this idea that like just working has some kind of inherent dignity and value, even if you're being treated terribly, even if you're being paid nothing, is ridiculous. And so like, yeah, I find this like a lot of people who run subminimum wage workshops will describe themselves as providers. Like they see themselves as providing a service by paying people, 3 cents an hour to grind little bits of metal or screw bottles onto screw tops onto shampoo bottles or tie popsicle sticks together. Like it's absurd. And we wouldn't tolerate treating non-disabled people like that, but because these people have disabilities and we have low expectations, it's sort of seen as acceptable.
Well, we started the conversation talking about the intersection of reproductive rights and disability rights. We've certainly seen a lot of disability rights advocacy groups and disability justice groups weighing in on what's happening with Britney Spears, but also the many, many countless women in particular, as we are hearing, it's a very gendered issue, forced sterilization and the forced use of contraception. Are we hearing the reproductive rights groups weighing in on this in the same way? Is there a possibility now of alliances between all these various different groups to really address some of these issues?
Yes, actually, so that's brand new. As far as I know, there haven't been any reproductive rights or reproductive justice groups that have really addressed this in terms of like sterilization of people under guardianship. So I know that I've heard some folks at Gnarl Pro-Choice have reached out to a couple different disability organizations, and that's like really early. I don't even know what's going on yet. I'm really excited to see where it goes. Hopefully I'll have a story about that when there's more to report.
Well, of course, the media controls so much of the narrative and the fact that many of these stories are not being told. Sara, you write extensively about this in The Nation magazine, in other venues as well. Where can people find out what's happening right now, given that we're not really seeing the coverage that we need to on these very important issues? Where would you direct people to really engage on these topics and find out more? And then if they want to add their voices to a chorus of support in some of these pieces of legislation that you mentioned, how might they do that? What are some of the organizations you'd recommend?
Well, I mean, so social media is a great place to sort of get in touch with the disability community. There's actually like a hashtag called Crip the Vote. Crip being sort of a reclamation thing that people with physical disabilities have done for the term. Sort of like how there's like a bitch magazine, like just sort of this idea of taking this slur and making it your own a little bit. And so the Crip Vote hashtag is a really interesting place to get in touch with a lot of grassroots community leaders. I know the American Association for People with Disabilities has a number of initiatives they've been running. There are local chapters of the Arc of the United States that they're a really interesting organization, although they tend to vary in terms, the individual chapters per state tend to vary in terms of like where they are on disability rights. It's a very like mainstream organization. So because it's such a big tent, you sort of encompass a lot of different viewpoints. In terms of journalists who write about this stuff that I admire, Joe Shapiro at NPR is the greatest of all time. He's been writing about this stuff since I was like a toddler. He wrote a book called No Pity. That's one of the sort of seminal histories of the disability rights movement. There's
your articles in The Nation magazine as well.
Yeah.
There's a wealth of information in the variety of different issues that Sara Luterman has tackled. Well, Sara, I really appreciate you joining us today on Just Solutions on Free Speech TV. And as I said, there's a wealth of information out there, and you can check out Sara's archive at the website for The Nation magazine, including her latest article looking at that intersection of reproductive rights and disability rights. Sara, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, next week we are taking a brief pause for Free Speech TV's Just Solutions, but we will be back again in 2 weeks' time, digging into lots more topics. So please do stay tuned, engage with us on social media, and join us in 2 weeks, same time, same place, from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.